Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series. Today, our event will come to you from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Our distinguished guest today is Ambassador Giorgi Badridze. Giorgi is a prominent diplomat and scholar from the Republic of Georgia in the Caucasus. I will introduce Giorgi to you in a minute. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've been running the Krasno events for the last 11 years, and we are still going strong. Today, we are talking about the future of Georgia, a European democracy or Russian client state. We will have a conversation with Ambassador Badridze and get as many insights as possible about the situation in the Caucasus and actually what is going on in the wider world. As many of you will know, in the process of the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, Georgia gained its independence. Former Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze became Georgia's second post-independent president. He was succeeded as president by Mikhail Saakashvili, probably still Georgia's most influential politician. In 2008, Georgia and Russia fought a short war with each other, and Russia annexed two Georgian territories, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. They are still heavily occupied by Russian troops and cut off from Georgia and indeed the rest of the world. Also in 2008, NATO controversially promised Georgia that it would eventually become a member of NATO sometime in the future. In 2022, the EU announced that Georgia might obtain candidate status for becoming an EU member if it fulfilled 12 conditions by October of 2023, so this year. Right now, it seems, however, that Georgia's prospects of joining either NATO or the European Union are not very promising. Becoming a member of both NATO and the EU is seen as an urgent necessity by the vast majority of the Georgian population of just under 4 million people. The Ukraine war has certainly added further urgency to this widespread belief in Georgia. Yet the current Georgian government from the Georgia Dream Party seems to have lost interest in the EU and NATO and appears to move ever closer to Russia. Georgia is thus a country in a most difficult and precarious foreign policy situation. Georgia is also confronted with many domestic problems of a political, social, and indeed economic nature. Democracy in Georgia seems to be backsliding as well. There's no one better to explain this complex and volatile situation to us than our distinguished guest today, Ambassador Giorgi Badridze. Giorgi Badridze has been a career diplomat in the Georgian Foreign Service since 1992. He served as Georgia's deputy ambassador to Turkey and ambassador to the UK. He also was Georgia's permanent representative to the International Maritime Organization. Ambassador Badridze is now a senior fellow at the Rondelli Foundation, the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies in Tbilisi. And this is how we met. When I first visited Tbilisi back in 2014, Alexander Rondelli and Giorgi Badridze were so kind as to explain Georgian politics and the country's external situation to me. Giorgi also teaches international relations at Tbilisi State University and the Caucasus University. Ambassador Badridze is also a regular contributor to the Georgian and international media and a very well-published scholar. He has contributed the most interesting article to the Krasno analysis series about the war in Ukraine, and not least, he has translated Henry Kissinger's well-known book, Diplomacy, into the very complex Georgian language. Ambassador Badridze, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Krasno event series today. Thank you for joining us.
Professor Larres, it's a huge honor to be with you. Thank you. Thank you for your hospitality back in Chapel Hill. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you. And it's great to have you here. And before I pepper you with some questions, let me just point out that as always, we are videotaping the event today for our famous YouTube channel, on which the videos of all our events can be watched again. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. We have a great international Zoom audience today, and everyone is most welcome to submit your questions to our speaker today by making use of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants, Emma and Trinity, will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Ambassador Badridze, let me ask you straight away, what is the situation right now between the pro-Russian Georgian government and the hugely pro-Western Georgian population? Doesn't that create a very tense situation in Georgia?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for your generous introduction of my modest persona, but also of the story of Georgia. And if I may, I would actually slightly edit some parts of what you just told our audience, because we in Georgia view some of the developments that you described slightly differently. For instance, I would say that Georgia was not really born out of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. It regained its independence that was lost to Russia twice. As recently as in 1921, when the Bolshevik Russia crushed Georgian Democratic Republic, by the way, championed by first Kaiser Germany and then British Empire. And before that, in the early 19th century, when Russia, instead of extended a protectorate to Georgia, basically annexed and did something that no other conqueror had ever done to the Georgian kingdoms before. As for the current situation, in a nutshell, it is a really curious one, because like you just said, Georgians in their overwhelming majority aspire to be a European democracy. They regularly, time after time, vote for the membership of the European Union, and the support for the EU membership regularly exceeds 80%. Not every EU member state can boast that. And the membership of NATO, where support is always above 70%. And yet, curiously, these pro-Western, pro-European nation is currently ruled by we cannot describe it in other terms, but by a pro-Russian government. How that is possible? In my opinion, this government can be described as a kind of a Trojan horse, because in 2012, when Bidzina Ivanishvili, a Georgian origin Russian oligarch, won the democratic election fair and square, he and every election since, he and his party campaigned on a pro-European, pro-Western platform. But to be perfectly honest, in the recent years, it has become quite clear that Georgian dream has never been quite genuine in its pro-Western proclamations. Yes, unlike Ukrainian President Yanukovych in 2014, the Georgian Dream government did sign the association agreement and the free trade deal with the EU, but instead acting upon those two instruments, they basically gradually reversed the policies that now made Russia Georgia's #1 trade partner. They returned into the Russian hands the economic and also energy leverages which Russia had lost under the previous government. And now it has become evident to our European and American partners then that Georgia has experienced a significant backsliding in terms of democracy. And this is why, like you just described, Georgia, unlike Ukraine and Moldova, was not given the candidate status by the European Union, but was given instead 12 priorities, which in reality are 12 preconditions. And these preconditions actually speak for themselves, because #1 is called de-oligarchization. And this is exactly what is the root of most troubles in Georgia. It's the root cause of Georgia's predicament at the time as we are. I would say that what we witness is a state capture by an oligarch. And it's worse than in other cases because other countries usually have several oligarchs which counterbalance one another and compete for influence. In our case, there is a single oligarch whose wealth basically compares to the country's GDP, and who has now extended his personal control over all branches of government. He recently tried basically to copy the Russian behavior and basically abolishing the NGO sector and the free media by introducing the so-called law on foreign agents. But it caused huge protests and they backed down. But in any case, what we deal with is a pro-Western, pro-European nation, which is now ruled by an oligarchy whose interests are very closely aligned in several areas, not everywhere probably, but in several areas with the Kremlin, not with Brussels or Washington, D.C.
But thank you. But how can the EU expect that de-oligarchization can be achieved within a few months by October of this year? Isn't that an impossible condition to meet, even in the best of circumstances?
Well, actually, this condition was delivered earlier last year. So almost 2 years were given to this government, but then instead, the oligarchic system entrenched deeper. So there is no sign of even attempting to address this issue or many others. As we stand, the European Commission has declared that Georgia has fulfilled 3 out of 12 priorities, and these were probably the easiest ones. For instance, the appointment of the public defender, who, in my experience, hasn't distinguished himself by defending the public, but quite the contrary, and other very technical issues. The most important fundamental things, such as, like I said, de-oligarchization, depolarization, which is basically one of the tools of this government of keeping themselves in government, addressing the independence of judiciary, and so on and so forth. These are going nowhere, unfortunately. So there is no sign. And this shouldn't come as a surprise. And I think our European partners should also ask themselves where they were for all these years. How come that they discovered that this government is doing these things just upon the Georgian application for the membership in the EU last year? And someone should have kept an eye, because we were, after all, members of the associated trio. And the association agreement is not just a paper, right? It's a list of supposed reforms which should have approximated Georgia to the European Union. And I think, meanwhile, what we have observed is the entrenchment of not very democratic regime that today finds itself closely aligned, at least economically and in some ways, in security-wise, with Russia, as opposed to the expected solidarity with Ukraine and with the European Union.
Let me ask you, because when you say that these 12 conditions were so difficult to meet, and that within 2 years, so that gives rise to the suspicion that the EU doesn't really want to accept Georgia as a member, that these are pseudo conditions which they knew right from the start that Georgia couldn't meet these conditions. Or would that be an unfair interpretation?
I would probably disagree, because I do not recall the European Union ever being so enthusiastic about the 3 countries and their European perspective. You said very kindly that I'm an experienced diplomat. Yes, from 91, I started as an intern and went up to the career ladder all the way to become an ambassador. And all of these years, for 23 years of my personal experience and later, the main headwind for Georgian diplomacy and Georgia's aspirations were that we weren't always meeting the kind of adequate response. There were doubts in Brussels and other capitals whether Georgia is Europe geographically, or maybe they don't need this much headache because Russia is acting aggressively and considers Georgia as an imperial backyard, this and that. And finally, this started changing 2014, first with the Russian annexation of Crimea. And now we got this breakthrough when the European Union finally offered the membership perspective that never happened before. It was cooperation, it was this and that, but never actual talk about the membership. And this is when we have a government which basically refused to act upon it. The conditions that were presented weren't really hard to fulfill, but it's hard if someone is determined to hang on to illegitimate levers of power. It's a choice of someone of hanging to power, hanging to controlling the state institutions. Otherwise, we've never been asked by the European Union to do something that would not benefit Georgia first. We've never been asked to do something for the European Union. I always said, even when there were many skeptics, and I spent most of my professional career promoting Georgia as a European nation, I've been told many times that it was futile, this and that. And I always argued that even if Georgia's European path does not end in membership itself, the European reforms would, at the end, create Georgia a better country for ourselves, right? So, like I said, I disagree that the 12 priorities that were given to Georgia were very hard to fulfill. It only would take a political will, which is lacking, and this is a choice of someone's personal interest over the interests of the long-term interests of Georgian nation, which has been trying to return to the European family of nations for centuries. If we had time, I would be happy to discuss how these aspirations originated, and that these are not the whim of some political elite, and it's not even a recent story.
Thank you. Thank you. Let us talk briefly about Georgia and its complicated relationship with Russia. Georgia used to be part of the Soviet Union. It has a very close relationship with Russia, but also a very difficult relationship, not least because of the war of 2008 and the annexation of 2 Georgian territories. How does Georgia cope with that? How does both the population and the government cope with that situation?
Well, with your permission, I'll start with history, like I mentioned. Since the disintegration of the United Georgian Kingdom, a very powerful regional kind of entity, a strong kingdom in the medieval times, the main strategic goal of all Georgian rulers was to somehow get a sort of protector from other Christian countries in the West. But we became physically, geographically isolated from the rest of Europe, and gradually we've been forgotten. By the way, one of the reasons why many very capable, well-educated academics or politicians view Georgia as something new is that the historiography which our history books are based upon was mostly created in the 19th, 20th century. And this is exactly when Russian Empire had wiped Georgia out of the world map and out of the history books. So you can be perfectly well-educated person and haven't heard about many things about Georgia. While it is one of the oldest nations with very, very long, 3,000-year-long experience of statehood. So to cut very long story short, while seeking Christian protection from other countries, European countries, and while this direction, Georgian diplomacy failed, finally at the end of the 18th century, Georgian king signed a treaty of alliance with Russia, which was basically about Russian protectorate for Georgia. But instead of defending Georgia from, say, Persian Empire, Russians allowed Georgia to be raided, destroyed in 1795, and then in early 19th century, the Russian Tsars basically annexed Georgia and left no autonomy whatsoever, not even a name on the map. It was completely gone. So in 1918, when the Russian Empire disintegrated, Georgia didn't think very long. It created Georgian Democratic Republic, which was first supported by Germany and later by the British Empire. But in 1920, by the way, you probably are aware, Professor Larres, and I would encourage you to see the works by Professor Stephen Jones on the First Georgian Republic. And it's not my words, it's his, that it was perceived as one of the shining examples of what New Europe could have been. And many Western European social democrats praised Georgia as a beacon of democracy at the time, with its very progressive constitution and many other things. But in 1921, Bolshevik Russia invaded Georgia, destroyed its independence, and annexed it into the Soviet Union. So when someone says that Georgia has been part of the Soviet Union, it needs to be emphasized that we never volunteered. It happened at the expense of our freedom. Mass purges followed, and yes, certain Joseph Jurashvili became known as Stalin. Yes, he ruled the Soviet Union with iron fist for some while, but he didn't rule it on behalf of Georgia or for the benefit of Georgians. Right? So the Soviet Union is a very complex thing, and out of it collapse again, Georgia was reborn. But while our Western friends were basically kidding themselves with this illusion that Russia is now emerging as some kind of democratic partner for the Western world, Russia's treatment of Georgia or Moldova must have been indications that it was not necessarily 100% genuine, the Russian transformation. Its foreign policy, its treatment of its neighborhood was typical to the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. And then we got not a real democracy as a legacy of Boris Yeltsin, but we got Putin. It is the physical legacy of Yeltsin that many people forget this. And again, even with Putin, with his background and everything, I mean, how could our partners in the West kind of have these illusions about him and his plans and ideals? And but then we got what happened. And you said that Georgia was controversially offered membership in NATO, and you probably alluded that this may have somehow angered Russia. But in reality, what happened in 2008 was the exact opposite. Germany blocked membership action plan for Georgia, which would have been just one more step. It didn't guarantee us membership. And this promise of eventual membership was just a consolation prize, which meant nothing, literally nothing, because membership action plan is the only practical mechanism for joining NATO. So what we got into is that the moment, whenever Russia thinks, their leaders think that they can afford it, they return to this expansionist, imperialist policies. And I often fail to understand how can this be misinterpreted as anything but a neo-colonialist policies of Russia.
So would 2008 have made a big difference if that path to membership had been offered to Georgia, if Angela Merkel hadn't blocked it, as you say?
Yeah, I think it would have made a difference, but let me give you an example. I mean, well, speculation is not always very kind of grateful thing, but I know one thing for fact. The moment the membership action plan was blocked, the moment NATO demonstrated its disunity, and the moment Putin felt that Russia was the major factor in NATO's internal discussions, he launched Russia into practical actions. And if you look at the timeline of events, how military preparations took place, how military exercises started on the border with Georgia, how Russian so-called peacekeeping forces were reinforced, how other practical military preparations were conducted throughout these months leading up to August. I think Putin perceived the Bucharest NATO summit as a green light to himself. He decided that he could afford engaging into military action because everything he did before that is classical Clausewitzian policy. First, Putin openly declared that he doesn't accept the historic fact of dissolution of the Soviet Union. He called it in Munich the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, as you remember. And then he started applying various kinds of pressures on Georgia: economic, energy, sabotage. And by 2006, when he cut off Georgia from Russian gas supplies, electricity supplies, when he announced basically unilateral economic embargo, and instead of Georgian economy collapsing, he saw 12.3% GDP growth in 2007. This is where he probably decided to switch into new gear. And the reason I mentioned Clausewitz is that his war in 2008 was just a continuation of his own policy by different means. So this is how we got there. I think the right way, right approach would have been demonstrating to Putin that no country within NATO would act on NATO business based upon their bilateral interest with Russia, or would not allow Russia, at least, to have a veto power on NATO decisions. Number one. And I never believed that Russia felt really insecure because of possible NATO expansion for two very simple reasons. NATO doesn't really pose any kind of threat to Russia. The only thing that changes with Russia's neighbors' membership in NATO is that this country becomes off limits to Russia. And it's very easily demonstrable. Look at Russia's, not recent, but a few years back, relations with its neighbors. It had most stable relations with NATO members and strategic partnership with some, including Germany. And the worst relations with the countries which were not fortunate to get on this bandwagon in 2004 and join NATO. So once again, we are dealing with Russia's neo-colonial expansionist policies. And one of the reasons why Putin decided to take these dramatic steps, first in Georgia 2008, then 14, and then in 2022, because he had this perception that he wouldn't have to pay a serious price for those actions, as he didn't in 2008 and even in 2014.
And why did he annex Abkhazia and South Ossetia to keep Georgia on its toes, to make Georgia increasingly dependent on Russia, or what were the reasons?
Well, slight correction. Technically, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are not yet annexed. They were recognized as independent states, although everyone should know that there is no independence to recognize there. It's de facto annexation. In that sense, I agree with you, but technically it's not exactly the same as what Russia did in Crimea. The conflict in the late 80s, even before the disintegration of the Soviet Union, in those areas was promoted by Russia as basically a leverage upon Georgia, where Russia saw, the Soviet authorities saw kind of increasing pro-independence movement. So at least from the Kremlin's point of view, the conflict is a very complex issue. I don't want to simplify it too much, but from the Kremlin's perspective, since the Soviet times, Abkhazia and South Ossetia were Moscow's leverage of keeping Georgia from trying to escape from the Soviet Union. And once the Soviet Union collapsed or imploded, actually, it was not necessarily due to those pro-independence movement, and it wasn't necessarily Georgian dissidents that destroyed the Soviet Union. It imploded, collapsed because of its own faulty political and economic system. But throughout the 90s, Russia continued to use these territories and the conflicts there as a weapon, basically as a leverage to keep Georgia within its sphere of influence. I know for a fact that Russian diplomats, many Russian diplomats, objected when in August 2008, Putin decided to announce the recognition of independence, because in certain sense, this weakened the leverage in the Kremlin sense. I'm not saying that Russian diplomats were less imperialistic or something, but speaking strictly professionally, they were more comfortable with keeping these conflicts as some kind of carrot and stick instrument. This was more or less the same way as Russia treated the Karabakh conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Again, I don't want to step into hot waters, and I'm not going into the origins or whatever of the conflict, but purely from the Kremlin perspective, Karabakh conflict was Russia's leverage over both countries and its way of keeping its military influence in the South Caucasus.
And now it's too late for Georgia to become a member of NATO, isn't it? Because NATO will not integrate or offer membership to Georgia with that situation, with two territories of Georgia being, at least semi-annexed by Russia. Well, or do you see any prospects for Georgia joining NATO anytime soon?
It would be a mistake in my view, and I think there is a practical way of getting Georgia into NATO without sparking automatically the war with Russia or even invoking Article 5. And this way has been discussed at length by some quite authoritative sources. And there is also a historic precedent for that. You would know, Dr. Larres, that Germany was actually, it became a member of NATO while eastern part of it was occupied by the Soviet Union, and at the time, Germany did not recognize Eastern Germany as sovereign country. But it came with a caveat that Article 5 would not extend to East Germany. Same way, there could be a caveat on Georgia's NATO membership right tomorrow, which would say that the Article 5 temporarily does not extend to the temporarily occupied territories. And this would give you one very important outcome, something that I more or less discussed in my introduction, that as long as you leave the gray zones, such as European countries, which are not fully integrated into the new European order, and Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which were willing to be part of Europe, were left in these gray zones. Sooner or later, Russia will try to fill it. And this should be basically a word of caution to those who now advocate, for instance, some kind of ceasefire and temporary peace deal between Ukraine and Russia without Russian withdrawal from Ukrainian territory. It would just serve as a pause, and then whenever Putin or whoever succeeds him has some internal issue, he will try to have another small victorious war to divert Russia's public attention from dismal way they are governed. And if I may have just 1 minute, I would describe what I think about the Russia's government system and how this is in the root of Russia's brutal expansionist policies.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I believe that all this "let's make Russia great again" policies, and or we have this existential threat coming from the West, and we need to be, we are this besieged fortress, is actually Putin's way of diverting public attention from very simple fact. And fact one is that Russia controls probably the largest share of the world's mineral and natural wealth. Fact two, Russia has talented and educated population. While Russia remains a poor country. Just before the war, Russia was somewhere down in the first 100s of the countries with GDP per capita. So how come this developed nation with vast resources, educated workforce, is poor? And how come that it is ruled by the world's richest people, who enrich themselves within a very short period of time? And this is a very significant question. And all those developments, attacking Georgia, attacking Crimea, going into Syria, etc., usually a mechanism by which an ordinary Russian citizen would be prevented from thinking why his roads are rotting, why his health care system is terrible, why his pension is terrible, etc. Now, Putin supporting mass is genuinely thinking about two main things. Putin is the only thing that stands between us and some Western decadent aggression against us, and he's someone who is making Russia great again.
Thank you. Tell us more about the impact of the Ukraine war on Georgia. There's been an influx of many Russians, some pro-Putin Russians, but also some anti-Putin Russians into Georgia, which has had domestic repercussions of a very serious nature. Tell us more about the economic situation in Georgia, and also about the democratic backsliding, which is connected with all that, I would say.
I would start with what is most visible in the country since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. On the one hand, Georgian streets are full with Ukrainian flags, graffiti with not very complimentary things to say about Putin and Russia, etc., etc. And at the same time, you have this influx of thousands and tens of thousands, some say hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens. And like you said, not all of them are fleeing the Putin regime, but some do, of course. But many of them actually are fleeing the inconveniences of sanctions. Number one, this was the first big wave of Russian newcomers to Georgia, which are anything but tourists, because they are staying there for an extended period of time, some for good. And then there was a second big wave of Russian migrants since September, when Putin declared a partial mobilization. And these were, in their overwhelming majority, the Dodge drafters. So again, many of them are not necessarily unhappy with Putin's imperialistic project, but as long as it doesn't take their sacrifice and them dying in the trenches in Ukraine. As for the social and economic implications, they are quite significant. For instance, many of my students last year discovered they couldn't come back to Tbilisi to rent flats because they were away during the pandemic, because the rent had tripled. So the same applies to everyday life costs for ordinary Georgians, which has increased dramatically, but not the income. So I thought from the very outset, and I have published a paper to that effect, that Georgian government should have welcomed many Russians, but had to be specifically more favorable to those who are fleeing the Putin repressions. And unfortunately, we got the exact opposite. In many cases, Putin opponents, journalists, politicians were turned back. As for how many of those many thousands of new Russian settlers in Georgia share the aspirations of Putin regime or cooperate with it, whether militarily, for instance, and how many Wagner members or others are in Georgia, nobody can tell.
Thank you. We are running out of time. We want to give some time for Q&A from our audience. But before we do that, tell us about the influence of China in Georgia. There have been some overtures recently, though China doesn't seem to be a very big factor at the moment in Georgia, or correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, recently we had very loud headlines about Georgian government and China engaging in strategic cooperation, which again, timing suggests that it's very odd for a country which is still, officially at least, claiming its government, claiming that is trying to get candidate status in the European Union and is embarked on the pro-Western path, but in reality, apart from many other things, now declare strategic partnership with China. On the other hand, there is no real substance to those proclamations. The only thing that is more or less practical is that the government declared visa-free regime for the Chinese nationals and the plan to have multiple flights, direct flights, connecting Georgia and China. We already had some Chinese economic activity in Georgia, at least the most visible ones were Chinese contractors building the strategic highway connecting East and West Georgia. Although this construction has been in the news for all the wrong reasons, as bridges or other installations been collapsing before being completed. So I wouldn't necessarily make a big thing out of those statements, including for one very simple reason, because China has been treating Georgia as a Russian backyard until recently, at least. For instance, Chinese activity changed in Central Asia, which initially was treated again like Russian backyard, but now things have changed, especially in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan more or less enjoys implicit Chinese security guarantees. Things are different with Georgia, but it would be interesting to keep an eye on the developments because the proclamations were very ambitious.
Mm-hmm. And how is the war in Ukraine going to end?
Well, so far, for a number of years, my predictions were sadly vindicated. In 2008 interview, I said very clearly, and I can share it with your viewers if you like, that if Russia gets away with a war in Georgia, there will be another war, and now right on the Europe's doorstep, meaning Ukraine, just before the war. Main invasion, kind of full-scale invasion in Ukraine. I'm on record on Euronews saying that the predictions that Russia would take Kiev in 3 days and would finish the whole affair in a couple of weeks was wrong. I said that it would be a lengthy and extremely bloody war, and unfortunately it is. But now it is much harder to make a specific prediction because there are now more variables. Because Ukraine's ability to successfully resist and successfully retake territory depends on actually not its own resilience only, but the determination of the European nations and the United States to keep supplying Ukraine and actually to supply Ukraine in more adequate times and quantities. And this again, in turn, depends on next year's elections, both in the US and in Europe. So I think it's very much in the collective West's interest to make sure that this is not just a temporary ceasefire by which this war ends, because this won't be at the end, unfortunately. Europe needs to see Ukraine win. This would be the only way to secure Europe's own.
What does win mean? What does win mean?
Sorry?
What does win mean?
Win means withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine's territory, including Crimea. Everything else will be just a temporary stopgap.
And is that likely without a major war, without even the use of nuclear powers being deployed?
From our recent experience, we don't have to speculate. From our recent experience, Russia has been claiming that it would resort on some very dramatic things, implying the use of nuclear weapons. And so many Russia's red lines have been crossed already. So I do not believe the use of tactical nuclear weapons is likely. But I know for sure, and this goes without any speculation, that unless Putin is defeated in Ukraine, the potential, or actually a likelihood, for a new, more dramatic conflict will always exist. It is in Europe's long-term strategic interest to make sure that Ukraine's borders are restored and that Ukraine does not, that Putin does not see any temptation, or whoever succeeds him, any temptation to, again, redirect to external expansionist policies instead of addressing Russia's need for reform, politically, economically, and socially. Russia could be a very successful country. It needs to focus its energy domestically, but its deeply corrupt government does the exact opposite.
The Georgian government, and then we really open it up to questions. The Georgian government focus a lot on its own domestic politics. A former president, Saakashvili, is in prison, or at least in hospital, in a military wing of a hospital, is severely sick, but no one seems to think to release him from prison. And then also there's the president of Georgia who is now threatened with impeachment. This doesn't sound like stable domestic politics. What's happening regarding these personalities?
Well, this is what happens when you have state capture. By the way, this is not how previous government treated the leader of the government which they succeeded in a Rose Revolution. Edward Shevardnadze, who you mentioned, who was a very important international statesman, but who, especially at the end of his presidency, presided over something that our Western partners called a failing state because of systemic corruption and everything. So the Rose Revolution basically swept him from power. Well, in a peaceful manner. Like I said, the new government, led by President Saakashvili, did not resort on some reprisals or something. Shevardnadze was allowed to keep all the privileges, the same residence, the security, and everything. And now this government, I mean, this is why I'm trying to emphasize this, because in case of some third world countries, whenever new government comes in power, they basically jail the previous one and etc. So I don't want our viewers to kind of perceive Georgia as some kind of semi-savage nation. And this is why I'm emphasizing, this is not how the previous government treated its predecessor. And number two, as for the current president, Madame Salome Zurabishvili has been elected at the expressed insistence of Ivanishvili's government. They directly participated in the presidential election. When she failed to win the first round, they basically replaced her photos on banners with the photos of Ivanishvili and his team. So they pushed the whole thing and they made her president. And now that she's trying to somehow engage in diplomacy to convince European capitals to extend the candidate status, they're more or less sabotaging her. And the last announcement, by the way, there is no practical way to impeach her. They do not have that kind of majority, the 2/3 of the parliament. But the very announcement that they are prepared, and they have launched the proceeding, to punish her for her attempts to further Georgia's European aspirations is very telling.
Thank you very much. Let's open it up to questions from the audience after we have had all these many insights. I'm sure lots of people have questions to you, perhaps questioning what you have said or trying to agree with you. And can I ask...
I hope I was provocative enough.
Absolutely. Emma, would you mind asking the first question, please?
Yes. So David Matlock asks, how realistic is it for Georgia to replace Russia and the other former Soviet republics with the EU? Isn't it rational for the country to do its best to preserve economic and cultural ties with Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia?
I mean, you had to, I don't want to be disrespectful to Mr. Matlock, but I'm not sure how much he knows about the Russian socio-economic or political system, that Russia is a full-blown dictatorship which keeps its population poor, where its very thin elite are basically a system of feudal dependency upon a supreme ruler. Why would anyone ever consider being part of that system if one had an option? So on the one hand, you have this system of illiberal autocracy that keeps their people's potential sealed and unrealized. And on the other hand, you have this great European triumph. I mean, I know how many Westerners and Europeans are very skeptical about the European Union, but maybe they have forgotten that European Union has delivered the longest period of peace, stability, and prosperity in the world's history. Okay, with all the problems that European Union experiences currently, this is the world's greatest experiment, a successful experiment of international cooperation. And NATO, the most successful ever international alliance, which has kept its members safe. Okay, so how can one even describe, why would anyone choose between successful, democratic, prosperous alliance and a poor dictatorship alliance? I'm not quite sure.
Thank you. Trinity, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, so we have David Matlock, and he asks, how realistic is it for Georgia to replace Russia?
No, we have...
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We have another question from Muriel, and it says, what is behind the Sino-Georgian strategic partnership to balance Russia? Georgian Dream's attempt to deal with Western pressure?
Well, I touched upon this slightly. I would reiterate, there is no substance so far that we could discuss about this in this strategic cooperation. It's just an announcement. Whether it has any potential, I don't know. Like I said, China is not going to demonstrate huge appetite to counterbalance Russia in Georgia.
What is China's economic influence in Georgia so far?
Not great. Like I said, some Chinese companies actually have been working as contractors on some infrastructural projects, very often financed by the European Union, by the way, and other sources. But its impact is very, I would say, insignificant. It's been rising. At some point, the trade turnover increased, but China is nowhere near the top economic partners for Georgia, at least so far. I don't know whether this new possible wave of Chinese tourists or some other things could change this, but like I said, I do not see very strong credibility in the declaration of strategic cooperation between the two. This only indicates that, and if you look at the texts that Georgian government basically signed up to, it mentions Chinese model, it mentions things that would indicate that this government does not really believe in democracy much. So,
thank you. Let's go to the next question, Emma.
All right, this one is from Zarab, and it's a little bit of a long question, but in summary, why can't the European part of Georgia's political and social environment provide the different projects for strengthening Georgia's economy and the processes of EU integration? And he cites leaders in 2012 who were successful and wonders why they cannot build one big factory now.
Well, because unfortunately, the European Union doesn't work that way. European Union is not a single government. Very often, European Union deliberately abstains from developing strategies in the areas which would actually benefit the European Union. For instance, for years, and this is again, might sound a bit bold, but for years, I believe Russia understood Europe's strategic interests in our part of the world, in South Caucasus, better than the European Union itself. And this is why it's been trying to cut off the so-called southern corridor or middle corridor. And this is why it insisted for many years of supplying the European Union with gas, including the gas that would come from Central Asia, right? But like I said, institutionally, European Union is not working like that, and European Union cannot open factories, to put it very kind of simply, in Georgia. But I agree absolutely that European Union could have developed much more effective Eastern Partnership, its neighborhood policy, and could have started working on bringing Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia closer much earlier. It took the war in Ukraine for offering the membership perspective. And with experience in Central Europe, we all know that membership perspective acted miraculously, very well, in basically stimulating the domestic reform in many countries. And it could have come very handy if the European Union was more serious about at least the associated trio. And this could have, by the way, become an interesting example for other Eastern neighborhood countries.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Trinity.
Yes, we have a question from Ben Hughes to ask the ambassador to comment on the degree or lack thereof of independent expression by the press and academics, and is tolerated by the current government of Georgia. Well,
Georgia remains, I think, the freest in that sense. which you probably have sensed. I'm a critic of the current government. I wouldn't accuse them of something that they haven't done yet. We have a degree of academic freedom, I would say, and free media still exists. But I also said that this year, there was a direct assault on these freedoms. The ruling party attempted to pass a law which would basically curtail those freedoms dramatically. They tried to announce all NGOs, academic organizations, and media who benefit from financial support from Western countries as foreign agents. It's a direct copy of what Russia did in 2012 and how Russia's remaining semi-independent media or NGO organizations basically were killed. So yes, we still enjoy certain degree of freedom, especially if you compare to other countries in our neighborhood. But those freedoms should not be taken for granted because, like I said, there were already attempts of assaulting them. And there are specific cases when, for instance, CEOs from media organizations or others have been attacked directly, personally. And the most notorious case is when last year, a founder and the CEO of the largest opposition TV channel has been jailed for 6 years for allegedly using his private company car for family purposes. He was, by the way, pardoned this year by President Salome Zurabishvili, which angered further his government. But the irony is that a couple of days ago, actually, a few weeks ago, it's been revealed that current Prime Minister took his son, a student at University of Pennsylvania, to his school by a government jet. All right, so these freedoms, to a degree, exist, but they are under threat, and the screws are being tightened gradually. That's my answer.
Yeah, thank you. Can we have the next question, please? Emma.
Yes. Brian Kulef asks, who controls the Georgian media and helps form public opinion in its direction?
So could you say it again, please?
Yes. So Brian Kulef is asking, who controls the Georgian media and helps form public opinion in its direction?
Well, there are a number of pro-government or actually government media organizations which are directly funded by the government and act in its interests. And you can be hardly more biased than they are. And on the other hand, you have about 4 or 5 independent, or let's call them opposition. They are not fully independent. They are opposition-minded media sources. TV remains in Georgia the most important source of information, and also some other media organizations, which, like I said, are under serious pressure. It's a financial pressure. It's a pressure on the advertisers, for instance, and donors. So there is basically this arrangement only, sadly, creates a further polarization. A part of society only watches one set of media, and the other part watches the opposition media. And very often they speak different languages, and many of the misunderstandings and tensions actually arise from this fact.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Could you tell us something about how elections are conducted in Georgia? Are they truly free, or are they being tried to be manipulated in a more serious way? I mean, we know all politicians, all parties try to obviously manipulate the elections outcome to bring it to their way by use of media, by use of advertisements and so on. But what is happening in Georgia? How are elections are being conducted?
Well, in the early years of Georgian Dream government, the elections were more or less uneventful because they felt that they had a real support from the population. As the support started waning down, they started resorting on the methods that are more typical to authoritarian regimes. And in recent years, basically the risks of rigging election, of using very inappropriate methods, only has been rising. And the next year's parliamentary election probably will be the most dramatic. Because now it's, for the first time, I guess, this government felt that they face the risk of losing power through election. Their candidate, like I mentioned, did not win in the first round, so they had to mobilize all of their energy, including certain using certain methods that would make this election anything but democratic. So next year the risks are even higher. So we need a proper observation operations from our Western partners. They need to know that the not just election day monitors, but long-term monitors are in place and that they are watching.
Trinity, do you have another question?
I do, from Lucas Shitani. As you mentioned, the election period is coming up in many countries, including the United States. Russia has a history of being able to have at least some influence on elections. How does this variable affect the West's resilience against Russia's subversion tactics and consequently its stance on the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, unfortunately, I have written about this. Russia has been disproportionately effective in affecting some aspects of Western politics. And it remains relatively effective in some other areas. For instance, in Africa, very cheaply, at very little cost to Russian budget, they basically wage wars in Africa. They manage to change regimes, right? As for the European Union and the United States, again, it didn't cost Russia too much to create certain lobbying groups, interest groups within the West. I'm not at liberty to disclose specific cases, but in my diplomatic experience, I've faced a number of individuals which were clearly acting as somehow on behalf of the Russian interest in very developed Western countries. So overall, I would say that Russia's one of the greatest achievements, well, if you call it that way, and that it has managed to export more corruption than oil and gas into the West. And we all saw that in 2016, Russia became a very important factor. It played a role. And no one should have any illusion that the troll factory that was operated by Wagner or other mechanisms are now put aside, that Russia would simply quit meddling in European or American political process. I think our democratic partners, the collective Western democracies, they need to look at their resilience more seriously.
Mm-hmm. Emma, thank you.
All right, our next question is a follow-up from David Matlock. He asks, would you prefer to give up existing exports to Russia, which is Georgia's second largest market? Rhetorically, should Mexico give up exports to the US given real historical offenses? Does the EU play a significant role in the Georgian economy?
Well, EU has been the largest economic partner of Georgia. They're simply, so these questions are slightly misinformed. I apologize for being so bold. Russia became top one of the top partners, actually it's top partner now, I think, because of political choice of this government. For instance, and by the way, this comes, and comparing Mexico-US relations and Georgia-Russia relations are completely inappropriate. I don't think that modern-day Mexico has any danger of being invaded and its democracy destroyed by the United States. And there is no risk of trading with the United States for Mexican entities, unlike unreliable, politically unstable Russian market, which can be closed just like that by the political decision of someone, if someone in the Kremlin thinks that Georgia misbehaves or something, like it happened in 2006. In 2006, Russia declared economic embargo on Georgia because of political reasons. Georgian wine, which traditionally is one of the important items of Georgian export, was declared as toxic. Okay? By the way, after this, it sold very well. It sold very well on European and other markets as freedom wines. So Russian market, as long as Russia remains a autocracy, a deeply corrupt country, would not be necessarily even commercially, economically beneficial to those who deal with it and who are not necessarily engaged in the same corrupt practices. And sorry, once again, and just to emphasize, Georgia had very strong economic ties with the EU and also Turkey. And these directions should have been reinforced, especially after the free trade deal with the European Union, which could have been beneficially used to attract more foreign direct investment, including from Russia, if they pleased. They could have built some business in Georgia, which would then trade with the European Union. And Georgia, in that sense, was a country with open economy, enjoying free trade deal with the European Union, which was, like I said, unfortunately not fulfilled. And simultaneously having very good trade deals with other major economies, including China. And instead now, Georgian economy has been reoriented toward Russia artificially. So I would rather have much closer ties with the EU, as it was possible, and not return Russia an economic leverage, which they have a track record of using against Georgia.
Can you tell us more about Georgia's role in the economic support of Russia in the Ukraine war? Georgia has become a transit country for many sanctioned goods, I believe. Is that really correct, or is that exaggerated?
Well, there have not been specific cases, but there are very unfortunate indications that this may be the case. For instance, the statement of the deputy chairman of the Russia's customs service indicates exactly that. He said that Russia basically made a hole in the system of sanctions using Georgia to connect with international markets. This is Russia's statement, not ours. Okay, and if you look physically at the Georgian-Russian land border, it's been busier than ever in its history. So, and also there are official data which indicates that Georgia started importing more and exporting more to Russia against the backdrop of sanctions, which should have been the other way around. So there are very worrying indications, and very serious questions should be asked. We recently had a visit of a trio of sanctions coordinators from the EU and US and UK. And we can only speculate what they discussed behind the closed doors, but there are serious worries whether Georgia is functioning, along with some other Russia's neighbors, as a black hole for sanctions.
Do we know which products are particularly going through that black hole?
Until recently, Georgia's been one of the major routes of import of automobiles to Russia. That has probably reduced now because I suspect because of the US pressure, American cars re-export to Russia has been banned. And now I think all automobile re-export to Russia is stopping. Okay, but otherwise, we would never know the real fact, because Georgian customs policy has been extremely relaxed, and it was arranged this way for many years by the previous government. The system worked as when only 1 out of 100 trucks, for instance, would be checked, to streamline, to have less red tape, to attract more transit goods through Georgia. But under the new circumstances, under the circumstances of war and sanctions, keeping the same policy is just completely, at least irresponsible, if it's not intentionally damaging to the system of sanctions.
Thank you. Trinity, do we have some other follow-up questions?
There are no more questions in the chat, but I do have a question for the ambassador. Personally, what is the possibility of a positive turn of events taking place for Georgia, its economy and culture in these next couple of months, given its current state?
Yeah. Well, now, to be completely honest with you, I do not believe that Georgia has any chance of succeeding as a European democracy, to just allude to the title of our discussion, to have a proper European future as its people desires under this government. This government has been given many chances to basically work in a way that would satisfy the absolutely strict criteria. But they chose to work in the self-interest of just one man, surrounded by the government, which basically act in his interest and their own. So as long as Georgia has this government, I do not see much prospect. The next natural question would be, why Georgian people tolerate the government which acts basically in contrary to its long-term national interest? The first part of the answer is that they thought otherwise. They thought they were voting for a pro-European party, which these illusions have been probably going away for a number of years. And the other factor is that, unfortunately, dissatisfaction with the existing government is not enough to replace it. We have to have a credible opposition, which, again, sadly, is lacking. Some say it's one of the successes of oligarch Ivanishvili, who basically decimated, destroyed the opposition. They are fragmented, they are weak, they fail to cooperate with one another, right? So they so far have not really demonstrated to Georgian voters that they can be taken seriously as an alternative. So I do not have a specific prediction for the next election, but under the current circumstances, I think Mr. Ivanishvili thinks that he can somehow stay in power for a long time or indefinitely if there is no dramatic new political development in Georgia.
Would you predict another Rose Revolution? If the people are 80% pro-EU, the government is totally differently. When will that come to such tension that people take to the street?
It's hard to say because, again, also as an advantage of this government, we have another trend in migration. We discussed the Russian immigration right? But we also have emigration, a mass emigration of Georgians. And record number of Georgians left the country last year. And during the last 10 years, this was actually a dramatic figure. So this means, and who would leave country first? The most dissatisfied ones. And the demography of migrants is also changing. Now more younger people are living with families. So basically those who should be coming to the protest or voting against Ivanishvili, many of them are actually leaving. So I don't want to sound too pessimistic, because frankly, in the early 2000s, many people also thought that, oh, there is no alternative to Shevardnadze. And then this alternative emerged quite quickly. Whether this will happen before next year, who knows?
Emma, I see that Brian Keeler has another question.
Yes, so Brian Keeler asks, we hear the word corruption in too many countries. Where is Georgia on this scale?
Well, if you look at the international ratings, you will be surprised to see Georgia among least corrupt countries. But I think these ratings are not catching up. Georgia really made huge progress. One of the reasons of the Rose Revolution in 2003 was this entrenched systemic corruption, which was largely broken through sometimes very draconian means, okay, by the previous government. Now, I would say there is no petty corruption. Our streets are kind of policed by police officers who do not take bribes, who are very proud of this. Georgian public service, again, remains corruption-free, mostly. So Georgian public service actually are a kind of subject of huge pride. You could Google Georgian Public Service Hall, and you will discover this streamlined services for citizens for everything. You can go and take your passport without a hassle, register property, get married, anything under the same roof. It's extremely convenient, all built by the previous government, by the way. So many of those elements still remain, but Georgia currently, you can say very clearly, is governed by a corrupt government. We just saw a very kind of unpleasant episode when the prime minister was basically exposed as using government jet for his student son. So, and many other things. But again, on the citizens level, we do not face corruption much. In that sense, we are ahead of many, many countries. But on the government level, I would say Georgian government cannot be described as corruption-free at all.
Thank you. Let me ask you two perhaps concluding question. One question with regard to the oligarch Ivanishvili that reminds us of the situation in Poland, which is an EU country, and it seems to be possible for one man, or in that case, formerly two twin brothers, to dominate the government of a country. That seems to have happened in Georgia as well. How could that have developed? What kind of skills did this man have to bring this about? In a way, you can say this is so unusual and requires so much skill and intelligence that you almost have to admire the people who are able to do that. So, of course, the outcome is very negative for the country. So how could that?
When speaking about the skills of Mr. Ivanishvili, one needs to start in the 1990s of Russia. It's murky waters when he managed to become a billionaire. Then it takes another set of skills to keep those riches, and most important, to leave Russia alive with those billions, right? And many things that he has achieved is probably not without certain help. For instance, today, the United States Treasury announced, or I'm sorry, Department of State announced that it sanctioned a new group of Russians that include a Georgian national who served as the first Attorney General for Ivanishvili. And it stipulates, this announcement stipulates that the gentleman actually has been actively collaborating with FSB. So it's not just economic activity that was the reason for the sanctions. One can only wonder why Mr. Putin, for instance, allowed Mr. Ivanishvili to take out about $2 billion out of Russia in the period right before the election. So we can only speculate, but yes, I can agree that what he has achieved takes serious skills, but the skills are not necessarily used for the benefit of the Georgian people. It's, like I said, it's classic state capture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And concluding from your talk, when listening to you, it all sounds very pessimistic. So is that really what you want to bring across, that Georgia is in a very difficult situation? The EU may well lose interest or decide that Georgia is not up to being a European or member of the European Union. And that would, of course, leave Georgia to be hugged ever closer by Russia and its pro-Russian government. Where does that leave Georgia? Somewhere floating in the middle, though very close to the Russian sphere of influence. So what is your prediction for the future of Georgia? Is it as pessimistic as I just indicated, or is there some optimism which you can also convey to us?
I'm not sure about optimism, but my hope is that Georgian people actually gets out of this state of depression and acts to ensure its future. Because Georgia's European future is being lost as we speak, and being lost against the will of absolute majority of the Georgian people, number one. Number two, I hope that these feelings will be met by adequate action from our European allies, who would realize that it's not just some nice people there, but that Georgia matters geopolitically and geoeconomically. We didn't have a chance to discuss it at greater length, but in very, very short, Georgia could play a very important role in linking the greater Black Sea region with the greater Caspian Sea region, and even provide an additional transportation corridor for goods that go back and forth between two huge trading empires, the European Union and China. But Central Asia alone would be enough for European Union to keep interest in developing infrastructure through Georgia. Georgia today is a main, actually the only outlet, economic outlet, gateway for Central Europe, Central Asia, that could bypass either Russia or Iran. Mm-hmm. If you look at the map, you'll discover that this huge landmass of Eurasia at one point can be only crossed either by Russia, Iran, or this tiny corridor made up by Georgia that links Central Asia to the Black Sea.
So that is your prediction for the future, that Georgia will be...
That is my hope.
Right.
That on one hand, Georgians get their act together, and on the other hand, it will be met with cooperation and greater support from the EU and NATO countries.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Badridze. Thank you for your insights, for your enlightening criticism of geopolitics regarding Georgia's place in the world and its relations with the EU, NATO, and of course, Russia. It was most interesting, and I think you gave us an awful lot of food for thought. So thank you very much for joining us today to our Krasno event series today. And before we say goodbye, I would just like to announce that our next Krasno event will already be next week, next Thursday, and we will talk about North Korea, actually. And more focus, we will talk about the sister of the leader Kim's and her influence in North Korean politics. And of course, Kim's sister may well succeed him or may well participate much more in power in North Korea than hitherto. So please join us next week again, and I will advertise it and send out mailings before then, of course. For today, I would also like to thank Trinity and Emma for doing such a good Q&A job with moderating and helping us here. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. And once again, Giorgi Badridze, thank you very much for coming to us and enlightening us with your thoughts.
Thank you.
All the best for now. Bye-bye.